nobody's one-dimensional. And so just because we find this or that aspect of what the Tannehills have to say problematic, I think it's really important not to put them into tidy little boxes and assume that we know exactly what they have to say and what they're up to. The reality is that they are interesting thinkers, creative thinkers who have useful things to say, and it's certainly worth learning from them even where we disagree with them. Now, the material assigned for today's reading is good stuff. I'm going to register some disagreements a little later, but in general, this is good stuff, and it really highlights what I like most about the Tannehills. Some commentators have suggested that this book has a kind of dated flavor. I think what they mean when they talk about a dated flavor is in part what I like most about the book. It really feels like it emerged from the human potential movement in the 70s. It's got a very optimistic, very positive flavor. And even though the Tannehills repeatedly talk about the merits of self-interest, and they clearly don't, in their official ideology, have much room for community or compassion, nonetheless, the reality is that what they have to say in these chapters, I think, is in general, again, I'll register disagreements, but is in general, I think, quite humane, quite generous, and quite compassionate. And I think this is some of the best stuff in their book. So this is my chance to say good stuff about the Tannehills. What they do in these chapters is simple. They talk about how what we think of as crime would be handled in a stateless society. I say what we think of because I think the whole notion of crime is, in fact, as I've said before, a statist notion. I don't think we're going to see much reference to crime in any realistic account of how society without the state would work. So how what we think of now as crime would be handled in a stateless society. The Tannehills envision a system in which the focus would be on compensation, in which compensation would simultaneously benefit victims and deter those inclined to cause harm, and in which the restraint of people causing harm would be limited to what was necessary to ensure that their victims were compensated. Okay? Now, I roundly criticized the Tannehills earlier in the course for their talk about retaliation. Retaliation to me feels like retribution, it feels like vengeance, but what's clear is that in general, this word, even if it's not a very helpful one, is being used by the Tannehills not to talk about vengeance, not to talk about retribution, but to talk about a combination of two things: defense against unjust aggression and the extraction of restitution for aggressive actions. And both of those things, it seems to me, can be had without any of the hostility and vengefulness that we might associate with retribution. So insurance companies, again, get pride of place in the model that the Tannehills have laid out here. And we might wonder whether the insurance companies we know are really up to the tasks that the Tannehills envision. But in any event, they lay out a case which has certainly been echoed by other writers, that indeed insurance companies might be especially well positioned to manage various kinds of risks, prevent injuries, provide compensation, and so forth in a stateless society. This is my cue, by the way, to suggest that you take a look at Bob Murphy's chaos theory. And if you just Google chaos theory and Bob Murphy, you'll find this little booklet, and you'll be able to download it in PDF form and read it. And you'll find Murphy going over much of the same ground that the Tannehills do, but taking a slightly different tack. Again, I think very cleverly getting at the question of criminal justice and the restraint of destructive people in a stateless society. Insurance companies figured there as well. So the Tannehills, as I've said, talked earlier about retaliation, but they take great pains in these chapters to distinguish their view from retributive views that are focused on causing harm rather than on securing restitution. Now, I have to stop here and offer an aside. I think the whole notion of retribution rests on a mistake. Okay? So when people talk about the importance of retribution, I think they're just fundamentally mistaken. There's just an error in their thinking. And the mistake is that a harm to you somehow doubles as a benefit to me. It seems to me, I don't know for sure, but it seems to me that there is an economic metaphor at work here. So the metaphor works like this. It assumes that there is a fixed stock of goods, okay? There aren't new goods. There's just the same old set of goods. So there's a zero-sum game going on. You take some that belong to me. I take them back because they belong to me. So when I gain, necessarily, you lose. But there's a problem here. I mean, yes, a gain to me in this situation may also be a harm to you, but it doesn't follow that just any harm to someone who's aggressed against me is also a gain to me. So while it's certainly true that if you take my stuff and I take it back, you've lost something that you had, and while that's not an unjust harm to you, it is in some sense a harm to you. But suppose you break my arm and I break yours. My breaking your arm is no gain to me, nor does it follow that what the victim is entitled to is something that's harmful to the aggressor under that description. That is, the victim may be entitled to something that is in fact harmful to the aggressor, but that's different from saying that the victim is entitled to harm to the aggressor as such. It may well be harmful to the aggressor, but that's not what makes it appropriate. What makes it appropriate is that the victim is compensated. And I don't think the Tannehills are disagreeing on this point at all. I'm just taking the opportunity to get on my soapbox and complain about retribution, which I think is often just ill-conceived. I really think it rests on a mistake. So the Tannehills are right that vengeance represents, it's a great phrase, a compound loss of value. I think that's a great phrase. I say 3 cheers for them. They are also right that there is nothing that entitles the state to act for the victim. So the notion of retribution is bad enough as it is. Things get even worse if the state says, well, you're entitled to retribution. That retribution we're going to exact. We, this organization, the state, will exact this. And what's happened, of course, in the last few centuries is that the state has come to treat itself as the primary victim. So if you think about in English history, the existence of a private wrong gets reclassified as a breach of the king's peace. So the convenient thing about this, of course, if you're the king, is that where before that private wrong ultimately had to be settled in some way between the wrongdoer and the victim, and there might be monetary transactions or whatever between the two of them. Now, if you say, well, this is a breach of the king's peace, then you're suddenly responsible for paying off the king. It's a great deal if you're the king, but it's not clear that it benefits the victim. But this is the kind of approach that the state has taken. The state, by claiming that some objective retribution is required rather than compensation to the victim, relocates the focus of the conversation away from the need to compensate the victim and makes it easier to justify taking on responsibility itself. If I have to pay restitution, it's very clear that I owe the restitution to the victim. But if retribution is owed so that I somehow just have to pay into the bank of justice, whatever that means, then it's much easier for the state to take responsibility and, of course, to impose fines on people and profit that way, and just to flex its muscles and impose its authority on people by limiting their freedom, imprisoning them, and so forth. So it's a great excuse. Talk about the importance of objective retribution is a great excuse for the state to expand its power. The Tannehills focus on immediate damages, damages directly caused by tortious conduct, by conduct that harms. They also focus on consequential damages. These are damages that result indirectly from harm. So, for instance, I steal your car. Because you don't have the car, you're unable, let's say, to make a job interview. And because you can't make the job interview, you don't get the job, and so you lose some money as a result of that. And the Tannehills not only suggest that the loss of the car ought to be compensated for, but also those consequential damages. There's something to this, but it does seem to me that, as in contemporary tort law, you would want to limit these to reasonably foreseeable ones. There is, I think, some limit on the extent to which it makes sense to talk about exacting compensation for distant events that might in some way be causally dependent on the commission of or non-commission of a tort, but that wouldn't necessarily be foreseeable. Now,